I'm excited to be speaking today with Dr. Edward Slingerland. He's a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia and author of Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way into Civilization, which we'll be talking about today. Edward, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time to speak with me. So I'd love to hear a brief overview of the book from you, and then we could go into more detail.
Brief overview of the book. It's basically trying to explain the puzzle of why the taste for intoxication has been preserved in human beings as a species. So why it hasn't been genetically selected against. And then also why the practice of making and consuming alcohol hasn't been eliminated as a cultural practice. So why prohibition has basically been tried for thousands of years and has very spotty success. And this is a puzzle because alcohol is quite dangerous. It's a dangerous substance. It's physiologically not good for us. It's costly in a lot of other ways. It damages our liver. It raises our cancer risk. It's estimated that up to 15% of the human population is genetically prone to alcoholism and can't consume alcohol safely. It takes up enormous amounts of resources. So one statistic is in ancient Sumer, they estimate that half the grain production went to making beer. So you have cultures taking healthy, nutritious grain and turning it into a low dose neurotoxin. Why? why do cultures that do that succeed and cultures that don't? Cultures that don't do that should outcompete cultures that do, and yet that's not what we see historically. So it's puzzling. And when I started to dig into it, I was really dissatisfied with the standard scientific answers to this question. So the standards, the most common, if you look at an intro text, psych text, I think the most common thing you'll see is a hijack story. So alcohol just happens to hijack reward centers in the brain that evolve for other reasons. And so, we're kind of like rats pressing the lever, getting cocaine, injected into our brains. We figured out we can trigger the circuit, and we just keep doing it. That's the hijack story. There are also a couple what I call evolutionary mismatch stories. So these stories argue that there was an adaptive function to having a taste for alcohol in our evolutionary past. Maybe clean water was hard to come by, and it's true that if you ferment contaminated water, it will purify it. Maybe it's the calories, maybe it's the micronutrients that you get from fermentation. There are a lot of these mismatch stories, but they're all what they have in common is they're claiming our taste for alcohol is an evolutionary mistake. Either it's always been a mistake in the case of the hijack story, or it was adaptive, but it's a mistake now. And it has been for thousands and thousands of years since we've been in large scale societies. And I just don't find either of those arguments convincing, given the massive costs on the other side. And given the fact that if it's a mistake, if our taste for alcohol is a mistake, there are solutions to the mistake. So it's possible that, if let's say you're adherent to the hijack hypothesis, you could say, yeah, sure, alcohol is costly. It would be genetically advantageous if we didn't like the taste of it, but that adaptation just hasn't happened. Natural selection just doesn't have the raw material to work with to the proper mutation that would make us not like alcohol hasn't arisen yet. But this is not true. There's a set of two mutations. There's clear selection pressure here. There's the debate about what they were selected for, but there's a set of mutations that affect our ability to metabolize alcohol that lead to what's sometimes called the Asian flushing syndrome, because it's most common. It arose around modern day Shanghai, kind of coastal China and in the south a bit. About 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, this gene complex arose. And if you have this complex, alcohol is unpleasant to drink. you flush, you feel nauseous after a few sips of alcohol. You just can't process alcohol. And so this is this genetic silver bullet to the problem of hijacking reward systems, right? It would be as if, we just suddenly didn't have a taste for other types of vices. We didn't like to eat Twinkies anymore. They tasted like cardboard to us, and Brussels sprouts and broccoli tasted fantastic to us. That's what this gene does. It's basically taking away the taste for alcohol. And yet it hasn't spread very far. It's been around for probably 10,000 years and has remained relatively geographically constrained. It hasn't really spread much beyond East Asia. And it's arisen, functionally similar mutations have arisen independently in other parts of the world and also remained very geographically contained.
So the idea is that if it was evolutionary adaptive to get rid of the taste for it, we would have seen that propagate everywhere. But since it hasn't happened, there must be other benefits.
Yeah, there must be some forces on the other side that are keeping the taste in our gene pool, or to put it another way, keeping these mutations from spreading very far. Mm-hmm. So the central thrust of the book is trying to explain what those functional benefits might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very interesting to see like an academic take on hearing some of the good side of alcohol, because obviously there's the health risks and all of mm-hmm. that, which you normally hear from scientists and doctors, but the history of these positive benefits is interesting to learn about.
Yeah, and it's not, you're right that the scientific literature on this is all medicalized. It's all treating alcohol as a health risk, or it's looking at addiction, or severe behavioral problems. It's hard to find, again, once I started doing the research, it's hard to find research on the function of alcohol in any kind of social way. It's always about alcoholism or the health problems, liver damage, cancer risk, things like that. And so, yeah, the other point of the book is to get us out of this medicalized mindset when we're looking at alcohol and actually take a broader anthropological, historical view and see what these other functional benefits are.
Mm-hmm. Right. So was this something you were looking into for a while, or did it come out of COVID, seeing that it was published this year?
No, I started it well before COVID.
Yeah, because I have heard of some research showing that alcohol consumption shot up during the quarantine, which
it has, yeah, and that's really so. One of the points of the book as well is that alcohol has become more dangerous relatively recently. So, for most of our evolutionary history, we've been drinking naturally fermented beverages and pretty weak ones at that. The most common kind of the median drink that any culture is drinking is some sort of beer that's probably coming in at 2 to 3% ABV. And you can get fruit wines higher. And then we've bred these super hardy yeast, to push them as hard as we can to get as alcoholic beverages as we can get. So you can get up to 16% ABV with some of these Australian Syrahs. But natural fermentation comes with this. Basically, alcohols always come with a safety feature, which is that at a certain point, the yeast poison themselves. They're more resistant to alcohol than bacteria are, which is why they're using it as a biological weapon against bacteria. So they get to use the calories and not the bacteria, but they're not infinitely resistant to alcohol. So they shut themselves down at a certain point. But humans are clever, very clever primates, and we figured out a way around this, which is distillation. So once you can distill liquor, so essentially boil off the ethanol, capture it, do this a few times, you can get like 90-something% ABV vodkas and these hard liquors. And these are so much more dangerous than the alcohols we've had access to historically. And it's a relatively recent. This surprised me too when I was doing the research. I guess I always assumed we've always had distilled liquor, but they weren't really widely available in Europe until like the 16th, 17th century, which which sounds like a long time ago, but I'm telling a story that starts 10 million years ago with our primate ancestors, right? So this is 17th century, is like yesterday in evolutionary terms. So we have this new form of alcohol that's much more dangerous. And then historically, alcohol has always been consumed socially. It's been historically vanishingly rare for you to have private access to alcohol. The only way you would get to drink would be socially. The alcohol is kept in a central place, or there's taboos against drinking alcohol. If you make it at home, you don't drink the stuff you make at home. And so you're always drinking in these ritually controlled situations where there's a toastmaster who's pacing the drinking, or there are, very strong norms about how much is okay to drink, when you're allowed to drink. And so cultures have always had, in social drinking, cultures have invented these, again, safety features that help us to drink responsibly through peer pressure and ritual and things like that. That's all off the table when you can be at home and have a liquor cabinet full of distilled liquor and pour yourself a drink whenever you want. And then that's gotten, COVID lockdowns made it wildly exaggerated. I mean, people stuck. I was doing quarantines because my partner's in the States, and I was going to visit her. And when I would come back to Canada, I would have to quarantine for 14 days by myself in my apartment, with a liquor cabinet and access to enough alcohol to kill a small village. We're not designed to drink responsibly in situations like that. So yeah, COVID's made it much worse. And hopefully, and the problem is if you reset your drinking at a higher level, it's hard to go back. And so I think that people now are struggling to get back to more healthy drinking at the pub, drinking with other people around meals.
Right. So historically, that social drinking, is that independent of like social eating? Because I'm imagining from an evolutionary perspective, maybe you only get food in a group anyways. So it's hard to have it's not like you'd have a fridge.
Yeah, right. So it's always coupled with feasting, right? You eat meals together, you drink together. That also is helpful because eating when you drink is helpful, right? It keeps your blood alcohol content lower if you have food in your stomach. So yeah, typically drink, not always. I mean, there are cultures where you drink and you just drink. There's no food involved, but typically it's been around communal feasting as well.
So distilled alcohol is more dangerous and more complicated to make and more of a recent development. But even fermentation has been a mystery how we discovered that, because it's essentially rotting fruit, right? And then someone just decided to go and drink it one day.
Yeah, I mean, fruit wines are incredibly easy to discover, right? If you come across rotting fruit that's starting to pool, that's alcohol. Like you've already got, it's not very good alcohol, but you've already got wine. So it's pretty easy to discover natural fermentation, especially with fruit, because it just happens spontaneously. What's a little bit more mysterious is things like beer, where very early on we figured out we had to malt. There's several steps involved. You can't just throw the grain in some water. You got to malt it and do various things to it. But that's not that much more mysterious than discovering bread. How yeast work. People figure this stuff out through trial and error. So alcohol is relatively, the reason I call it the king of intoxicants. And there are a few reasons for that. But one of them is that it's very easy to discover and it's very easy to make, and you can make it out of almost anything. You just need a sugar or a carbohydrate. People can make it out. People have made it out of anything. So it's easy to discover. It's easy to make. You can make it anywhere. It's easy to dose. It has a relatively short half-life in the body because we evolved to eat semi-rotted fruit. So we have cut machinery in our body that's waiting for ethanol. It attacks it right away and gets it out of our body as quickly as possible. So it's got a pretty short half-life in our body. So you experience the cognitive effects and then they go away. There's a reason that, when you look around the globe, by far the most commonly used chemical intoxicants, alcohol.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I discovered it by accident at one point. I had a jar of applesauce that was way expired, and
Way expired.
it smelled like alcohol, but I didn't dare drink it. It kind of smelled
Yeah,
gross, so I threw it out.
yeah.
And I'm wondering, the people who first discovered it, is it like they're starving, so they have to eat it, and then maybe afterwards they get a buzz and think, hey, this isn't so bad? Or
Maybe.
like, at what
Yeah.
point do you think it crosses from like stumbling across it to deliberately going out of your way to make it?
Yeah, it's got to be the case that it was either out of desperation, you're hungry as fruit's kind of not looking great, but you need the calories, and so you eat it. And then you experience these cognitive effects. Your serotonin and your endorphins get boosted. Suddenly, you're feeling a little happier about yourself and other people, and you learn to connect it with that rotted fruit that you ate. And it doesn't take people very long to figure stuff like this out.
Hmm.
And it's also the case with psychedelics of various kinds, plant-based chemical intoxicants. If there's something in the environment that will get you high, people have discovered it. It's really amazing. And even if it's really obscure stuff that you have to process in all these really complicated ways, people have figured out how to get high. So it's also interesting, just the amount of ingenuity and effort that goes into human beings getting themselves intoxicated in various ways.
Right. So that sounds kind of like a mix between this mismatch hypothesis and your social drinking hypothesis, because it seems like to discover it originally, it must have been due to that, like to getting extra calories, or maybe just due to that accidental high. And then only
Mhm.
once you realize it, do we start like forming civilizations based around this?
Right, right. And so the story, one of the ways in which alcohol is connected to civilization is this beer. I talk about the beer before bread hypothesis. So, I'd always been taught that we had agriculture first, and then at some point, someone left their sourdough starter sitting around, like your applesauce, right, and started to ferment. And they tried it, and they're like, yeah, it's weird tasting, but ooh, I feel kind of good. And then they start, we have beer. Um, but it looks like it was the other way around. So hunter gatherers were coming together and making beer for sure, probably fruit wines as well, thousands of years before we had agriculture. And so the argument is that it's that whatever the calories, the high, the triggering of the reward circuits is what lured hunter gatherers into settled agricultural life. So in that sense, the drive to get intoxicated very directly led to civilization. But then once these hunter gatherers had made that transition and they're living in settled communities, it also helped them solve various problems that come with that transition of lifestyles.
Mhm. So the problems would have to do with like it makes you more relaxed and more opening, more outgoing to strangers, stuff like that.
Yeah, so it reduces anxiety and enhances mood, which is probably helpful if you're living in a pretty crappy early agricultural village. The move from being hunter gatherer to agricultural communities was negative for most individuals for a really long time. The early agriculturalists had, they're living suddenly in these dense communities all on top of each other. They're often doing more repetitive work now. Um, their diets got a lot worse because they're eating more just starches and breads, not eating as much vegetables and fresh fruit and fresh meat. And it was probably a more boring lifestyle than being a hunter gatherer. It was less, there's less, there were fewer challenges, there's less diversity of experience. And so alcohol probably helped with that. You have a long day of dragging stones to build a pyramid, or repairing an irrigation canal. It's a way to relax at the end of the day. It also, one of the other functions I explore is this creativity enhancement function. So around the world, throughout history, there's been this idea of alcohol as a muse, right? It's kind of enhancing. Alcohol's always been associated with artists and creative types. And there's a good reason for that. It actually, by downregulating our prefrontal cortex, it's increasing our ability to think, to engage in lateral thinking. So to come up with solutions that you can't just get to through brute reasoning. You have to have an insight. There's evidence that alcohol helps with this, and then it's enhancing individual creativity. It's also reducing our inhibitions, which means that it's helping with group innovation. I'm individually coming up with more interesting, diverse ideas, and I'm also disinhibited. So I'm telling you about them, even if maybe normally I'd feel self-conscious or I'd think it was a stupid idea. So it's a key engine for group innovation. And one of my arguments is that human beings as a species are really unusually dependent on innovation because we're completely dependent on tools. We couldn't survive without tools, unlike any other species. And so we need to be innovating constantly. And alcohol has been used as a tool to help us to do that. So that's one of the functions of alcohol. One of the other important functions is getting us past these cooperation dilemmas. So we often face these prisoner's dilemma type situations where the best payoff comes if we can trust the other person. But it's also a situation where we're vulnerable to being cheated, where the other person could not cooperate and impose costs on us. And yet humans solve these cooperation dilemmas all the time in the real world. And one of the ways we do that is arguably because we have this technology, alcohol, that makes it easier to trust people. So there's a reason, every culture I know of, if you've got potentially hostile individuals or at least unfamiliar individuals, and you need them to sit down and agree on something or put aside their differences and join forces or at least reach some kind of agreement, the alcohol comes out. And that's because, again, one of the functions is downregulating your prefrontal cortex. It makes it harder to lie. So lying is a really complicated cognitive task. If I'm lying to you, I've got to keep track of what I'm telling you, which is untrue. But I also have to keep track of reality. And so I have to keep those two things together in my mind, which is, to start with, very hard. I've also have to suppress any facial expressions or reactions or emotions that correspond to reality and not the lie that I'm telling you. So it requires really severe cognitive control and repression of emotions. It's really hard to do, and it's all centered in the PFC, the Center of Executive Function and Cognitive Control. So if you can take the PFC down a few notches, you just make it harder for people to lie. And that's more intuitive. What's interesting is that it also seems to make us better at detecting lies. So you're better at picking up lies if you're a little bit drunk.
That's interesting.
Which is surprising, but it seems to be the mechanism seems to be that we think we know how to detect lies, but we don't. So like we read some detective novel where, if he looks sideways, he's lying. But there is no one tell. The real way to detect lying is to kind of be really open and take in a lot of data and crunch it in this very complex, unconscious way. That's how you can kind of pick up on lying. And we're better at relaxing and taking in data that way when we're a little bit drunk. Right. It's also pumping up serotonin and endorphins, which make us more inclined to cooperate and to like people more.
Right.
So it's removing the barriers to cooperation by making it harder to lie, and then also enhancing the desire to cooperate by pumping up these pro-social hormones.
Right. In certain contexts, it can also make you more aggressive, though, right? So is it like it sort of raises the stakes in either direction? It makes you more cooperative if your party's cooperative, but it makes you more aggressive if they're not cooperating.
It's disinhibiting you, so it can make you more aggressive if you're an aggressive person. It also can reduce the barriers to aggression if you are placed in a situation that calls for aggression. And it's also just energizing. So one of the functions of these hormones is just to up your energy level. People think of alcohol as a depressant, but it's a stimulant as well. It's both a stimulant and a depressant. It's doing different things, different parts of the brain, often all at the same time. It's really confusing. This journalist Stephen Brown has called it a pharmacological hand grenade. It just is hitting all these different parts. It's stimulating all these different hormones all at the same time. It's downregulating PFC. It's over the time course of inebriation. The effects are changing. So it's a really complicated drug.
So you mentioned back in the day we were drinking much lower alcohol percent drinks. So is there like a sweet spot for when these positive benefits come up, and then if you go over that, then you just get like drunk and you start seeing more of the negatives?
Yeah, so about 0.08 BAC seems to be the sweet spot. So that's around where you shouldn't drive anymore. That's typically the drunk driving limit in most jurisdictions. So that's about 2 drinks in for most people. Depends on your weight and if you've been eating and things like that. So about 0.08 is where you get these creativity boosts. So 0.08 probably to 0.10 or so. You get the endorphins, serotonin's cooking, your inhibitions are down, but you're still alert, and you have your motor functions intact. Once you start getting to like 0.2, 0.3, you're getting into stumbling, slurring territory. It's really, I mean, this is again why distilled liquors are so dangerous, because it's hard to get that drunk on a 2% beer. It's just physically difficult to drink that much liquid that short a time. But you can get that drunk really quickly on tequila or vodka because it's so much stronger. So then you get into dangerous levels of inebriation where the depressant functions start to swamp out everything else. And you can start depressing motor functions, including breathing, which is how people can get to the point that they die. They shut down their breathing with alcohol. So those are, most of the functions that I talk about kick in at that sweet spot of about 0.08.
And it seems like alcohol popped up like roughly 10,000 years ago across cultures. Was that an independent discovery, or is it like something that was shared and propagated over time?
No, it was independently discovered around the world. So the earliest direct evidence we have in the Fertile Crescent is, so in the west roughly, is 13,000 years ago. There's a site in Israel, present-day Israel, where they have remains of beer making that's been chemically shown to be beer making. And then in East Asia and the Yellow River Valley, there's fruit wine. I think the oldest, again, chemically detected alcohol is from about 9,000 years ago in the Yellow River Valley. But it almost certainly goes back a lot farther than that. We've got
a coincidence that it's roughly the same time period across cultures.
I do. Yeah, I don't think there's any kind of axial age mysterious thing going on with the discovery of alcohol. I think it's just at a certain point, humans get dense enough on the planet that they start discovering these technologies and sharing them, and start creating advanced enough technologies that they leave archaeological traces. Right? You have to have a pretty big scale society before you can build something that will last 9,000 years for archaeologists to discover. So, that it takes people a while to ramp up to that level of complexity.
So then for the next 10,000 years or so, was it kind of just this stable thing? I mean, up until distilled liquor was discovered?
Yeah, I think drinking cultures have remained fairly stable around the world. All cultures develop specific rituals to deal with alcohol. All cultures seem to be aware that alcohol is kind of a double-edged tool, right? It's got these positive functions, but it's also dangerous. Every culture that discovers alcohol immediately starts talking about prohibition. So some of the earliest legal codes we have from early China are these really harsh prohibition edicts. You'd be put to death if you're caught making or drinking alcohol. And yet the tombs from this period are full of vessels that were used for drinking. Chinese never stopped drinking. So yeah, it's been, cultures seem to have had similar worries about alcohol, and they seem to come up with similar types of strategies for managing it and keeping it safe. So things like these, toasting rules and rules about when and where you can drink it and things like that.
What about alcohol with religion, where sometimes you can get these polar opposites of like maybe one culture will have a god of wine and they'll like celebrate him and drink, and then another culture might have like alcohol is a sin, don't drink it.
Yeah, yeah. So there are groups that have tried successfully to ban alcohol. Islam, I mean, most people think of Islam. Islam's been kind of inconsistent on the whole prohibition thing. So it's been, official doctrine for quite a long time, but the degree to which it's enforced is really varied historically. It's also varied depending on whether you're talking about elites versus commoners. Often elites kind of flouted rules about alcohol. But you have also groups like the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, you have Pentecostals who ban alcohol. So it's an interesting, I do talk in the book about what about prohibitionist groups? Like if alcohol has all these functions, why do some groups ban it? And in the case, what I argue is that often, first of all, if they ban it, they often replace it with something that does something very similar. So Pentecostals, for instance, don't drink, for very strict anti-alcohol, but they engage in these religious rituals where they get really wound up and they start speaking in tongues and handling snakes and falling down on the floor possessed by the Holy Spirit. They've developed ritual techniques to get themselves into the same state of intoxication that you would get with alcohol. Sufis, use dancing and rhythm and things like that to get into these types of intoxicated states. So they often, religions that ban chemical intoxicants will often figure out ritual ways to get the same effect. And the alcohol ban in particular seems to be really more of a group function and a group binding device than targeted at alcohol per se. So one of the arguments about Islam is that they were surrounded by these wine drinking Mediterranean cultures, and they wanted to say, we're different. We're not like these people. Arguably the same thing is going on with the Mormons. How do we distinguish ourselves as a group and create group identity? We wear this funny underwear and we don't drink alcohol. We don't drink. And for me, the telling thing is that they ban caffeine as well, which if your concern is intoxication or the dangers of alcohol, why would you ban caffeine? But if your goal is to impose costs on your members that make them feel bound to the group and give them a group identity, then it makes perfect sense that you ban these things that everyone likes to do. So I argue that when you see prohibition as part of religions, and that's when it seems to be successful. It seems to be really hard to get prohibition off the ground unless you make it a religious thing, unless you put the power of religion behind it. But in these situations, it really seems to be serving more of a kind of group marker, a costly signal that binds people together than an actual response to the problem of alcohol.
That's interesting. So how about in the opposite direction where alcohol gets associated with religion in like a positive way? Is it a coincidence that we refer to hard liquors as spirits? Like I'm wondering if the word was developed talking about like you're possessed by the spirit of Dionysus or something like that.
Yeah, I actually I'm not sure what the origin of the use of spirits to refer to, but I wouldn't be surprised. So the positive association between alcohol and religion is the norm. We tend to think about modern Christianity sometimes in terms of evangelicals who don't drink, but Christianity and wine are like this, right?
It's
the blood of Christ. It's as I point out in the book, it's the first miracle Jesus performs is turning water into wine. I thought it was something else, but my partner pointed out, no, it's the first thing he does, and it's a great story because they're at a wedding, and the wine runs out, and it's like this disaster. And so Jesus's mom is like, Jesus, you got to do something about this. And he doesn't want to show his power yet. He's not ready to perform a miracle. But she's like, this is an emergency. We need wine. And so he goes in the back and he turns this big keg of water into wine. It's a great story. The other great detail is when the steward distributes it. It's of course, the most delicious wine anyone's ever had. And so he declares, I violated the first rule of party planning, which is, always serve the worst stuff last. That's what you do at a party, right? You don't bring out really good wine at the end of the night when people aren't really tasting it anymore. And so that was apparently the rule in Galilee or wherever this wedding was. Okay. Can we pause for a second? That's the fire alarm people. Hold on a second.
Yeah, so it seems like in the past there were clearly these positive associations, and then when was it, 16th century, that distilled liquor comes around?
16th, 17th, yeah.
So then, well, I know a little bit about American prohibition, but is there anything that stands out in those like 400 years or so that we should talk about?
That's an interesting point about the timing. It's possible that you start to get a hardening of attitude toward alcohol and Christianity around the time distilled liquors become popular. And certainly, Prohibition was targeted at saloon culture. And saloon culture was very much organized around hard liquor. There's also, I think, really strong religious response to the gin craze in England, which was, I think, in the 1600s, early 1700s, where suddenly England got flooded by this cheap gin from Holland, and people it was like the opioid crisis. Like, it just caused a massive disorder, and there was a strong religious response to that. So maybe the hardening of attitude toward alcohol and Christianity is linked to the creation of these really dangerous new forms of it.
Mm-hmm. So alcohol addiction, was that not as much of a problem before, when you just had like these low alcohol percent beers and wines?
It's less of a problem, especially if you don't have private access to them, right? You can only get them in group settings. It's less of a problem. So what's interesting is the genetic propensity for alcoholism is probably the same all over the world in humans, but actual alcoholism rates vary quite a bit. And that's probably because of cultural factors. So in a culture, so I talk a little bit about the difference between northern versus southern drinking cultures. So this is referring to Europe. So northern drinking cultures drink a lot of distilled liquor. They drink to get drunk. They drink to drink and not with food as part of meals. It's something only grown-ups do, and typically only men do. It's forbidden to children. Being drunk is kind of celebrated or considered manly. It's something you do is to show that you're a real man. Cultures like that have really high alcoholism rates. And then you have Southern European cultures like Italy, where actually the per capita consumption of alcohol is higher than in these Northern European countries. It's quite high. And yet you have very low alcoholism rates. And that's because the cultures there, you're drinking mostly wine, maybe beer. It's always done around the meal table. You don't drink away from the meal table. And it's done in the family. It's kids are there, old people are there. Kids are introduced to alcohol at a very early age. So even quite young children get a little bit of wine watered down in their glass, and start drinking small amounts of real wine pretty much younger than in the States, for instance. And all of that together, drunkenness is really frowned upon. So drinking to the point that you're visibly inebriated is kind of, people look at you sideways. It's not cool. All of these things seem to help tamp help people to drink more responsibly, even if they have a tendency toward alcoholism. So cultural factors can really help.
So earlier when we were talking about like the selection for or against Asian flush, I would assume that there would be a selection for like more Southern drinking cultures, but that doesn't seem to have happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it is the norm cross-culturally, I think. If you look at alcohol use cross-culturally, it looks more like the Southern model.
Right.
You drink with meals, you drink in the family, you know, everyone's together. I think it's skewed a bit because the Northern drinking culture got spread all over the world by colonialism. So, you know, the US, Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand are all Southern drinking or Northern drinking cultures just because of the influence of Britain, right? So it is true that this hard drinking culture did happen to get spread to a lot of parts of the world. But I think if you want to look over the course of history and cross-culturally, you'd find that most cultures tend to look more like Italy and less like Denmark, Russia.
So it seems like based off all this, that the moral of the story isn't surprising. It's like drinking is okay in moderation, but excess is bad. Now, but also from this conversation, I started thinking, oh, well, what if prohibition worked just with like the alcohol above a certain like volume percentage? Has that been tried out before? Or is that something you'd even advocate for? Or is it more like we have the spirits, we have to stick with them and just focus on moderation at an individual level?
I think that so it's been tried on college campuses. There are college campuses where distilled liquors are forbidden. Beer and wine are allowed, but they allow beer and wine. There are jurisdictions where, oh shit, hold on a second. Yeah, there are jurisdictions.
Some college campuses which have this like half prohibition.
Yeah, and there are parts of the world where you can, you know, jurisdictions where only beer and wine sales are allowed. There's a lot of liquor stores that are only licensed to sell beer and wine and not spirits. So people do treat them as different. I just don't think we do that enough. Like, I really think, even though it's just ethanol, we really should treat distilled liquors like a completely different and much more dangerous drug. So I think what would make sense, and it's possible that there are countries that have these sorts of laws, is different drinking ages for different types of alcohol. Like the drinking age for distilled liquor should be a lot higher, and drinking ages for wine and beer, I think, should be lower. That would make a lot of sense.
Does any of that have to do with brain development, the higher age for higher liquors?
Yeah, so the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to mature, and it doesn't mature until mid-20s or so. So drinking, if you're my daughter's 15, and she, you know, in her school there is drinking, and the kids get a hold of whatever tequila from their parents' liquor cabinet and drink it. Depressing your prefrontal cortex and directing poison at it when it's not even done developing yet is a really bad idea. So yeah, these really strong alcohols that can really have a negative effect on your PFC, doing that before your PFC is fully developed is dangerous. It could as adults, at least, it's the part of our brain's already fully formed. But that's why I think that the kind of, if you wanted to invent an unhealthy drinking culture, you would take a bunch of young people without fully developed PFCs and throw them together without adult supervision and no cultural norms, and give them a bunch of distilled liquor.
And that's what college.
Yeah, I'm describing college, right? That's what a frat party is. So it really is the most unhealthy, dangerous way to drink imaginable.
Yeah, so knowing that and writing this book discussing more of the positive sides of alcohol, do you think, I know we talked about earlier the sort of gap in the literature on the positive sides, but do you think you did a good job finding that balance of talking about what's okay and what's not?
I hope so. I want to, you're always going to get people who are angry about any defense of alcohol and they're often people who have either personal or family connections to alcoholism. And you have to be sensitive to that. I mean, but I do think I do a fairly good job of, the whole point of the book is, why do we do this? It's really dangerous and bad for us. So why do we do it? It's a puzzle. It wouldn't be an interesting puzzle unless it was really dangerous and bad for us physiologically. So I hope that, I do a good job of framing, making clear the dangers while still making the point that given the dangers, it really is kind of a scientifically interesting question of why we continue to drink.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think this conversation helps unpack a lot of the mystery. So thank you very much for your time, Edward.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of fun.
And be sure to check out his book, Drunk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.